Welcome to the unknown zone, where the hidden corners of history, science, and truth are brought into the light. Today, we uncover one of the most secretive operations in modern history, an operation that changed the world forever. And yet, most people have never even heard its real story. This is the true story of Operation Paperclip. The year was 1945. Europe was in ruins. The world had just witnessed the most destructive war in human history. Cities reduced to ashes. Millions of lives lost. But as the smoke began to clear, a new battle was already taking shape. A silent, secret battle. One that would define the future of the world for decades to come. It wasn't a battle fought with tanks or soldiers. It was a race for minds, for knowledge, for the scientific power once hidden behind Nazi Germany's Iron Curtain. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, they began uncovering things no one expected to find. Underground laboratories filled with rocket parts and blueprints. Aircraft so advanced they seemed to belong to another era. Chemical formulas for gases, biological weapons, and experimental drugs. And documents, thousands of them, stamped with the emblem of the Third Reich, describing technologies that were years ahead of their time. The Nazis had been planning for a future most nations couldn't yet imagine. Jet propulsion, guided missiles, nerve agents, and human experimentation that crossed every boundary of morality. It was horrifying, and yet, to some, it was also an opportunity. The Allies knew the war had been won on the battlefield, but the next war, the war for global dominance, would be won in laboratories and research facilities. And so, even before the last shots were fired, intelligence officers began a new mission: to find the scientists behind these discoveries, to capture them before someone else did, because someone else was already on the move: the Soviet Union. As the Red Army pushed westward, Stalin's agents were collecting their own trophies, documents, prototypes, and above all, people. Scientists, engineers, doctors, the men who had built Hitler's war machine. The Americans called their mission Operation Overcast at first. It would later be renamed Operation Paperclip. The name came from the paperclips used to attach the scientists' new American security files to their old Nazi records. The paperclips meant approval, clearance, a second chance, a rewritten past. The goal was simple on paper: bring the best of German science to the United States. But the moral cost was far from simple. Many of these men had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had used slave labor. Others had experimented on prisoners. And now, instead of standing trial, they were being recruited, protected, and paid by the very nations that had defeated them. It began with the rockets. Germany's V2 program had terrified Europe. Supersonic missiles that struck London without warning, each one a symbol of death falling from the sky. But behind those weapons was genius, a team of brilliant engineers led by a young man named Wernher von Braun. Von Braun had joined the Nazi Party and the SS, but his dream wasn't war. It was space. He once said, "My rockets worked perfectly, except they landed on the wrong planet." To him, the V2 was just a step toward reaching the stars. But for Hitler, it was a weapon to terrorize his enemies. When the Third Reich began to crumble, von Braun knew his days in Germany were numbered. The Soviets were closing in from the east, and he understood what would happen if he fell into their hands. He gathered his team, about 500 of Germany's top engineers, and destroyed most of their documents to prevent them from being captured. Then, In May 1945, they surrendered to the Americans in Austria. It wasn't an accident. Von Braun had carefully planned it. He knew the Americans would see value in his work. And he was right. U.S. intelligence officers quickly realized what they had found. The V-2 rocket wasn't just a weapon. It was the foundation of a new kind of warfare, and possibly the key to reaching space. They began collecting everything they could: blueprints, prototypes, and the scientists themselves. Soon after, the first group of German scientists was quietly transferred to the United States. They arrived with new documents, new names, and promises of safety. Many of them didn't even go through immigration checks. They were assigned to military bases and told to start working immediately. The American public had no idea. To the public, these men were ghosts. No records, no past, only results. Wernher von Braun was taken to Fort Bliss, Texas. There, he and his team were ordered to recreate the V-2 rocket from memory. They worked day and night, assembling pieces of the future from scraps of the past. Their new masters were no longer wearing black uniforms. They wore olive drab and carried the flag of the United States. Von Braun wasn't the only one. There was Arthur Rudolph, the production director at the Mittelwerk factory, where the V-2s had been built using slave labor from concentration camps. He too was brought to America. Years later, he would become a key figure at NASA, managing the Saturn V program, the very rocket that took humans to the moon. Then there was Kurt Blohm, a high-ranking Nazi scientist who had overseen chemical warfare and human experiments involving plague bacteria. He was tried at Nuremberg but acquitted, thanks in part to American intervention. Afterward, he quietly joined U.S. biological warfare programs, offering his expertise on pathogens and toxins. These men, and many others, became part of the new American machine, the hidden foundation of post-war science and technology. Officially, their Nazi pasts were erased. Unofficially, everyone involved knew the truth. The program grew quickly. By 1946, more than 700 scientists and engineers had been relocated to the United States. By the early 50s, that number exceeded 1,600. Among them were experts in aerodynamics, physics, medicine, and psychology. Some had designed the world's first jet engines. Others had studied the limits of the human body at high altitude and under extreme pressure, often through inhumane means. The U.S. government justified it all as necessary. The Cold War had already begun, and the Soviet Union was racing for the same knowledge. In their logic, if America didn't claim these scientists, the Russians would, and that couldn't be allowed to happen. In Moscow, Stalin launched his own version of Paperclip, known as Operation Osoaviakhim. Soviet agents rounded up thousands of German specialists and transported them eastward, sometimes at gunpoint. Entire factories were dismantled and shipped to the Soviet Union. The race for technology had become a race for the future itself. But in the American narrative, Operation Paperclip remained buried beneath layers of secrecy. Presidents Truman and Eisenhower publicly claimed that no war criminals were being protected. Behind closed doors, their advisors were rewriting files and cleaning records. It was said that entire dossiers were sanitized, Nazi affiliations removed, political connections erased, crimes reclassified as alleged. What mattered now was utility. Could this man help build a missile? Could he help create a jet fighter faster than sound? Could he help America win? If the answer was yes, morality could wait. The scientists were placed in new homes, often with their families, in small American towns. Some became professors at universities. Others worked at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, White Sands Proving Ground, or the Redstone Arsenal. They were no longer prisoners of war. They were assets. To the people living next door, they were just polite German engineers who spoke with heavy accents and kept to themselves. No one asked too many questions. Meanwhile, in Europe, the stories of their pasts were slowly fading. The world wanted to rebuild, to move on from the horror of war. Few people cared to ask where those brilliant American scientists had come from, or what they had done before they wore their new flag. But the truth had a way of resurfacing. Years later, journalists and historians began piecing together the puzzle. Declassified memos, court testimonies, and interviews revealed what the government had tried to bury. They told of men who had used slave labor, men who had designed weapons of terror, men who had conducted human experiments, and how those same men had built the rockets that sent America to space. For the Americans running the program, it was a moral gray zone they refused to discuss. The justification was always the same. If we hadn't taken them, the Soviets would have. And perhaps that was true, but it didn't make it right. The war was over, but in the ruins of Germany, a new war had quietly begun. A war not fought with guns or tanks, but with knowledge, technology, and minds. Both the United States and the Soviet Union knew one thing clearly. The nation that controlled the minds of Germany's top scientists would control the future. Rocketry, nuclear power, jet propulsion, chemical weapons. These were no longer just tools of war. They were tools of domination. And so, in the ashes of Berlin and Peenemünde, teams of American intelligence officers began their hunt. Their targets were not Nazi generals or politicians, but engineers, physicists, doctors, and chemists who had worked for Hitler's war machine. At first, it was chaos. Dozens of scientists fled west, hoping to surrender to the Americans rather than fall into Soviet hands. Others went into hiding, burning documents, erasing traces of their pasts. But by late 1945, the US had a plan, one that would change history forever. It was called Operation Overcast, the first version of what would later become Operation Paperclip. The mission begins. Under Operation Overcast, the US military began secretly interviewing German scientists who had worked on advanced weapons programs. Many were detained, interrogated, and offered a choice: imprisonment or cooperation. But it wasn't so simple. Many of these men were deeply involved with the Nazi regime. They had built weapons that killed thousands. They had conducted experiments on prisoners. They had sworn oaths to Adolf Hitler himself. And yet, the US government saw them as too valuable to lose. When Soviet forces began capturing scientists from the eastern territories, the urgency escalated. Washington authorized a classified expansion, codenamed Operation Paperclip. The name came from the paperclips attached to scientists' files, the clip marking those to be secretly approved for relocation to America. Wernher von Braun and the rocket team. At the heart of the mission was one man, Wernher von Braun. Von Braun had been Hitler's prized rocket engineer, the man behind the deadly V-2 missile program that rained destruction on London and Antwerp. Yet now, he was America's prize. Captured along with his team in May 1945, von Braun and more than 100 scientists were transported first to a camp in Bavaria, then to the United States under false paperwork. Their Nazi pasts were quietly sanitized. SS memberships were erased. War crime accusations were ignored. And suddenly, these same men who once served Hitler were now working for Uncle Sam. Von Braun's arrival in the US was shrouded in secrecy. Officially, they were technical specialists. In reality, they were some of the most advanced rocket minds on Earth. Men who would soon design the weapons and spacecraft that defined the 20th century. A Cold War born from ashes. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union wasn't sitting idle. Their own teams were raiding German labs, capturing engineers, and transporting them to facilities deep within the Soviet Union. The race for scientific supremacy was on. In America, von Braun and his team were stationed at Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. There they began testing and reconstructing V-2 rockets, analyzing their mechanics, and sharing their expertise with American engineers. It was here that the seeds of the Cold War space race were planted. The American military saw the potential immediately. These German rockets could carry more than explosives. They could carry messages, satellites, even nuclear warheads. And as the 1950s dawned, the United States' relationship with its former enemies deepened. Publicly, America had defeated Nazism. Privately, it was now embracing the very scientists who had built its machinery. The moral question: not everyone approved. Inside Washington, a moral and political debate raged. How far should America go in erasing the past for the sake of progress? The Justice Department, the State Department, and even some military officials warned against bringing Nazi collaborators into the US. But the argument that always won was simple. If we don't, the Soviets will. And that single line justified nearly everything. By 1946, more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians had been relocated to the United States. Many brought their families, their assistants, and even their research documents. They were installed in military bases, given new identities, and in some cases, new lives. Some were even granted citizenship, hidden pasts, and quiet lies. One of the most disturbing realities of Operation Paperclip was how the truth was hidden. The U.S. intelligence services, primarily the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or JIOA, systematically altered or destroyed records to conceal Nazi affiliations. For example, Arthur Rudolph, one of von Braun's close associates, had overseen forced labor at the Mittelwerk facility, where prisoners from concentration camps were worked to death building V-2 rockets. Yet in America, he became a respected NASA engineer and later received the NASA Distinguished Service Medal. Another case was Hubertus Strughold, known as the father of space medicine. His experiments in Nazi Germany had involved prisoners subjected to freezing and low-pressure conditions. But in America, he became a celebrated figure in aerospace research. These weren't isolated cases. Dozens of paperclip scientists had blood on their hands, yet they were protected, honored, and funded by the US government. The public unaware. For the American public, the truth was hidden behind patriotic progress. The headlines spoke of technological miracles, rocket science, space medicine, aeronautical innovation, all credited to American genius. Few knew that behind it all were men who once designed weapons for Hitler. In Nome, the small desert testing sites of New Mexico, V-2 rockets soared into the sky, symbolizing progress and hope. But to those who knew, each launch was a grim reminder that the foundation of this progress was built on suffering, on death, and on silence. By the early 1950s, Operation Paperclip had become one of the most successful secret programs in history. The scientists it brought to America would shape everything from NASA's Apollo program to missile defense systems during the Cold War. The transformation of Wernher von Braun. As the decade advanced, von Braun himself underwent a remarkable transformation. He became the face of American rocketry, appearing in magazines, on television, even collaborating with Walt Disney to promote space exploration. Few dared mention his Nazi past. Fewer still knew that his designs for the Saturn V rocket, the very rocket that carried humans to the moon, were based on his V2 concepts from the Third Reich. When Neil Armstrong took that famous step onto the lunar surface in 1969, it was, in a sense, the final chapter of Operation Paperclip. The war had ended nearly 25 years earlier, but its shadow stretched all the way to the moon. The hidden legacy. Even today, the legacy of Operation Paperclip remains controversial. Some call it a necessary evil, a pragmatic decision that gave the US a technological edge during the Cold War. Others call it a moral failure, proof that in pursuit of power, even the victors can compromise their humanity. But the facts remain. Without those German scientists, the United States might not have reached the moon as early as it did. It might not have developed certain missile technologies. It might not have won the Cold War. Yet, the question still lingers. At what cost? The war had ended decades ago. The rockets had flown. The world had celebrated its victories in science, in exploration, in technology. But underneath the triumph, something was quietly buried, something uncomfortable. For nearly 30 years, the truth behind Operation Paperclip remained locked away in classified files, hidden behind walls of secrecy, bureaucracy, and patriotic propaganda. Most Americans had never even heard the name, and those who had didn't know what it truly meant. The secret that wouldn't stay buried. By the early 1970s, America was in a different kind of turmoil. The Vietnam War had torn at the nation's conscience. Watergate had shaken trust in government. And for the first time, journalists were beginning to question the long-protected narratives of the Cold War. Among those curious few were investigative reporters and historians who began asking dangerous questions. Questions like, who really built America's rocket program? And what happened to the Nazi scientists after World War II? When the first Freedom of Information Act requests were filed, fragments of the truth began to surface. What they found was disturbing. The declassified files, declassified documents from the Pentagon and the State Department revealed a web of deception, names erased, files altered, identities rewritten. A secret army of German scientists had been imported under false pretenses. Their Nazi affiliations were not just overlooked. They were actively hidden. Reporters uncovered internal memos from the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, instructions to remove incriminating evidence, to alter biographical data, to sanitize backgrounds. And then came the names. Men like Arthur Rudolph, celebrated NASA engineer. Men like Hubertus Strughold, the father of space medicine. Men like Walter Schreiber, Kurt Blohm, and Walter Dornberger. All had once stood under the banner of the Third Reich. Some had been directly involved in human experiments, forced labor, and war crimes. And now, they were living comfortably in America, protected by the very nation that had fought to destroy Nazi Germany. The investigations begin. When the first major expose appeared in the New York Times in 1973, It sent shockwaves through the public. Headlines called it America's secret Nazi imports. Television anchors read the stories with disbelief. How could the United States, the supposed moral victor of World War II, bring war criminals onto its soil, give them new names, and put them in charge of national research? Congressional committees demanded answers. The Department of Justice launched investigations. And slowly, the moral compromises of Operation Paperclip began to surface in the open. For decades, the government had defended the program as a national security necessity. But now, the public wanted to know, was it worth it? The scientists respond. Most of the paperclip scientists denied any wrongdoing. Wernher von Braun himself, before his death in 1977, was often asked about his Nazi past. He would simply smile, pause, and say, "My concern was always rockets, not politics." But the truth was far more complex. Von Braun had been a member of the SS. He had worked directly under Heinrich Himmler's supervision, and the rockets he built were assembled by slave laborers who suffered and died underground in the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. When survivors were interviewed, they described the horror. Cold, dark tunnels, men collapsing from exhaustion, the sound of guards shouting, the smell of death. For every V-2 rocket that successfully launched, dozens of prisoners had perished building it. And yet, von Braun's image remained untarnished in American history books. The genius engineer, the visionary who helped take humanity to the stars. Arthur Rudolph. The NASA scandal. In the 1980s, one story in particular reignited public outrage. The case of Arthur Rudolph. Rudolph had been the project director of NASA's Saturn V rocket, the one that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. But as investigators dug deeper, they found something darker. Rudolph had once managed the Mittelwerk facility, where thousands of concentration camp prisoners were forced to work under brutal conditions. When confronted with the evidence, he admitted knowledge of the deaths, claiming he had no control over the labor situation. The U.S. Department of Justice charged him under the Office of Special Investigations, the branch responsible for tracking Nazi war criminals. Facing deportation, Rudolph renounced his U.S. citizenship in 1984 and quietly returned to Germany. He lived the rest of his life in relative obscurity. The man who had built the rocket that sent men to the moon died with the weight of thousands of unseen victims on his conscience. The question of morality. The Rudolph case reopened old wounds. It forced Americans to confront an uncomfortable question. How far should a nation go in the pursuit of progress? Can the sins of science ever be separated from the men who committed them? And if the ends justify the means, what does that say about us? The more people learned, the more they questioned the legacy of Operation Paperclip. Was it truly a triumph of intelligence and strategy, or a betrayal of justice and human decency? The propaganda machine. For decades, U.S. agencies had carefully shaped the public image of the paperclip scientists. Films, documentaries, and NASA press releases portrayed them as brilliant minds who helped America rise. Von Braun appeared in Disney specials about space exploration. He was presented as the smiling, visionary face of science. But none of those programs ever mentioned Mittelwerk. None mentioned the corpses buried near the rocket tunnels. None mentioned the prisoners who died to make those dreams possible. History, it seemed, had been rewritten, not by lies, but by omissions. The Soviet perspective. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union had its own version of Operation Paperclip, called Operation Osoaviakhim. In 1946, Soviet troops captured over 2,000 German specialists and transported them east, along with their families. Among them were some of the top minds in rocketry, jet propulsion, and physics. Their work directly fueled the creation of the Soviet space program and the eventual launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957, the world's first artificial satellite. So in the end, both sides had done the same thing. Both had recruited men who once served a genocidal regime. Both had turned war criminals into scientists, and both had justified it in the name of survival. The shadow of Paperclip. By the 1990s, as the Cold War came to an end, many of the surviving Paperclip scientists were gone. Some had retired quietly, some had died honored, and some had faded from public memory. But the documents, the files, the testimonies, the photos remained, and historians began piecing them together, uncovering the scale of what had been done. They discovered that at least 1,600 scientists were officially brought to the US, though some estimates went as high as 5,000. Entire families were relocated. Millions of dollars were spent to protect, house, and employ them. And through it all, one fact stood clear. America's greatest technological leaps were born from the ashes of Nazi science. The dual legacy today, historians and ethicists still debate Operation Paperclip. To some, it was the price of progress, a pragmatic decision that helped the West survive and triumph in the Cold War. To others, it remains one of the darkest compromises in modern history. The story of Paperclip is not just about rockets or research. It's about how nations justify their choices, how easily morality bends when fear and ambition collide, and how the line between right and wrong can vanish when history is written by the victors. The rockets touched the heavens. The scientists became legends. But the truth remained buried beneath the stars. For every leap forward in technology, there was a step back in conscience, and for every triumph, a shadow. Because sometimes the most powerful discoveries are not about what we found, but about what we chose to forget. This was The Unknown Zone.